A humble farmer walks into a luxury airport showroom to buy his dream private jet, only to face brutal mockery and discrimination from the elite salespeople who judge him by his weathered clothes and calloused hands. Little do they know, this farmer's story is about to teach them an unforgettable lesson about appearances and respect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. As Thomas pulled up to the Sterling Executive Airport in his dusty pickup truck, the gleaming glass building housing luxury aircraft sales seemed to mock his humble appearance. The late afternoon sun reflected off the massive windows, creating an almost blinding glare that matched the intimidating aura of the place. He parked his well-worn Ford F-150 between two spotless luxury vehicles, a Bentley and a Mercedes, the contrast as stark as night and day. Inside the prestigious showroom, wealthy customers in tailored suits browsed multi-million-dollar jets while sipping expensive coffee from delicate porcelain cups. The air was heavy with the scent of leather and success, punctuated by the subtle notes of designer perfumes and colognes. Thomas took a deep breath, adjusted his worn baseball cap that bore the faded logo of his family farm, and pushed open the pristine glass doors, leaving a small smudge from his work-hardened hands. The moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Conversations quieted to whispers, and heads turned in his direction. A sleek salesman in an Italian suit who had been animatedly discussing features with a well-dressed couple paused mid-sentence to stare at Thomas with poorly concealed disdain. The farmer might have spent his life feeling at home among his crops and machinery, but here, surrounded by luxury and judgment, he felt like an unwelcome intruder in a world that clearly didn't want him. Thomas's weathered boots echoed against the polished marble floor as he made his way toward the main display area. His calloused hands, stained with years of honest work, felt rough and out of place in this environment of manicured perfection. His denim overalls and flannel shirt, though clean, stood in stark contrast to the sea of designer suits and dresses that surrounded him. A young receptionist at the front desk visibly grimaced as he approached, her perfectly manicured hands hovering over what appeared to be a security button. "Sir," she said with forced politeness, "are you sure you're in the right place? The agricultural equipment showroom is actually in the next county." Thomas cleared his throat, fighting back the urge to turn around and leave. "No, ma'am," he replied firmly, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had built something from nothing. "I'm here to look at private jets, the Gulfstream G650 specifically." A burst of poorly suppressed laughter erupted from a nearby group of businessmen. The receptionist's eyebrows shot up, disappearing beneath her perfectly styled bangs. She exchanged knowing looks with a colleague, the kind of looks that spoke volumes about their assumptions. "I see," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Well, all our sales representatives are currently occupied with serious buyers. Perhaps you could come back another time?" She emphasized the word serious in a way that made it clear she didn't consider Thomas to be one. Thomas stood his ground, though his heart was pounding. He had faced down drought, hail, and market crashes, but this kind of blatant discrimination was testing his resolve in ways he hadn't expected. The corner of the property deed in his pocket, proof of his recent sale of 3,000 acres to a major development corporation, felt like it was burning a hole through his clothes. "I'll wait," he said simply, moving toward one of the sleek leather chairs in the waiting area. A well-dressed woman quickly gathered her designer purse and moved to a different seat, as if his presence might somehow contaminate her. From his new vantage point, Thomas could see the object of his dreams, a magnificent Gulfstream G650, its pristine white exterior gleaming under the showroom lights. He'd spent months researching private aircraft, learning everything he could about them in his spare time between managing his vast agricultural operations. The irony wasn't lost on him that while these people saw dirt under his fingernails, they couldn't see the empire he'd built from that very dirt. As he sat there, Thomas couldn't help but think about his journey to this moment. 30 years of pre-dawn mornings, battling unpredictable weather, managing dozens of employees, and strategically expanding his operations had led him here. The success of his organic farming venture, combined with the recent land sale, had finally made his dream of private air travel possible. Yet here he sat, being judged by people who probably couldn't tell wheat from barley, or understand the complexity of running a modern agricultural business. The whispers around him grew more audible, and the stares more obvious. "Must be lost," one man muttered to his companion. "Or maybe he's the janitor," another replied with a snicker. Thomas remained seated, his exterior calm despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. He had earned his place here, whether they knew it or not, and he wasn't about to let their prejudice deny him his dream. After what seemed like an eternity, a sales representative finally approached Thomas. Alexander Wright, as his golden name tag proclaimed, wore an expression that barely masked his contempt. His perfectly pressed suit and meticulously styled hair stood in stark contrast to Thomas's practical workwear. "Can I help you?" Alexander asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather be doing anything else. His eyes darted between Thomas's mud-stained boots and the pristine showroom floor, as if calculating the cleaning bill. Thomas stood up, extending his hand in greeting. "Yes, I'm interested in purchasing the Gulfstream G650. The salesman ignored the outstretched hand, instead taking a small step backward as if afraid dirt might leap from Thomas's palm to his designer suit. "Sir," Alexander began, emphasizing the word with mock politeness, "the G650 is our premium aircraft, priced at approximately $65 million. Perhaps I could interest you in some brochures instead?" He spoke slowly, as if explaining something to a child. The group of businessmen who had been watching the interaction burst into poorly concealed laughter. One of them, a silver-haired executive type, whispered loudly to his companions, "$65 million? He probably thinks that's the number of potatoes he needs to sell." Thomas felt his face flush, but maintained his composure. "I understand the price point," he replied calmly. "I'd like to discuss the specifications and available customization options." Alexander's perfectly groomed eyebrows arched higher. "Sir, this is a serious establishment. We deal with high-net-worth individuals who actually have the means to purchase our aircraft. Not," he paused, gesturing vaguely at Thomas's appearance, "people who are clearly out of their element." More customers had gathered around, drawn to the spectacle like vultures to carrion. A woman in a designer dress stage-whispered to her companion, "Security should really screen people at the door. This isn't some tractor showroom." Thomas stood his ground, though his hands had unconsciously clenched into fists at his sides. "I assure you, I'm quite serious about this purchase. Perhaps if you could just show me the aircraft—" "Listen," Alexander cut him off sharply, his pretense of politeness evaporating. "I have genuine clients waiting. This isn't some farm equipment shop where you can kick the tires and waste everyone's time. The cleaning staff will have to sanitize any surface you touch." The humiliation was building, but so was Thomas's determination. He thought of his father's words. "Son, your worth isn't in your clothes. It's in your character." Those words had carried him through tough times before, and they would carry him now. "I understand you have other clients," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the tension. "But I'm here as a serious buyer, and I expect to be treated with basic respect." Alexander let out an exasperated sigh. "Basic respect? Sir, do you even know how to spell Gulfstream? This is a prestigious establishment. We have a reputation to maintain. I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call security." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Other customers had formed a loose circle around them, some filming with their phones, others whispering and pointing. Thomas could hear snippets of their conversations. Can you believe the nerve? Probably some kind of prank. What's next, a shepherd shopping for a yacht? A young sales trainee watching from behind her desk looked uncomfortable with the situation, but remained silent. Thomas caught her eye, and she quickly looked away, unwilling or unable to challenge her superior's behavior. "I won't leave," Thomas said quietly but firmly. "Not until I've been shown the same courtesy you'd show any other potential customer." Alexander's face reddened with anger. "Security," he called out, his voice echoing through the showroom. "We have an unwanted visitor who needs to be escorted out, As two security guards began making their way across the showroom floor, Thomas reached slowly into his pocket. The movement caused the guards to tense up, but what he pulled out wasn't what anyone expected. It was a business card, not his own, but one belonging to his son-in-law, a prominent aviation lawyer. "Before you do anything hasty," Thomas said calmly, "you might want to consider the legal implications of discriminating against a qualified buyer based on appearance." The card seemed to give Alexander pause, but only briefly. "Anyone can print a business card," he scoffed, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Security, please remove this person from the premises." Just as the security guards were about to reach Thomas, a booming voice cut through the tension like a thunderclap. "Well, well, if it isn't Tom Miller, the king of Montana organic farming himself." All heads turned toward the entrance, where a man in his 60s stood with an air of unmistakable authority. Robert "Bob" Henderson, dressed in a casual but clearly expensive polo shirt and slacks, strode across the showroom floor with the confidence of someone who belonged there. His presence seemed to fill the space, commanding attention and respect. The security guards hesitated, looking uncertainly between Alexander and the newcomer. Bob's reputation in the aviation industry was legendary. He owned one of the largest private charter companies in the Northwest and was a frequent customer at Sterling Executive Airport. "Thomas, you old dog," Bob exclaimed, embracing Thomas warmly, completely disregarding the dirt that might transfer to his clothing. "I heard you finally sold that prime piece of land to the developers. About time you treated yourself to something nice." Alexander's face had turned an interesting shade of pale. "Mr. Henderson, sir, you know this gentleman?" Bob turned to face the salesman, his friendly demeanor cooling noticeably. "Know him? This man single-handedly revolutionized organic farming in 3 states. His distribution network supplies half the high-end restaurants in Seattle and Portland." He clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "And more importantly, he's one of the most honest businessmen I've ever had the pleasure of knowing." The atmosphere in the showroom had shifted dramatically. The previously smirking customers now looked uncomfortable, some even slinking away toward the exits. The young sales trainee who had witnessed everything was furiously taking notes, perhaps realizing she was watching a masterclass in how not to judge a potential client. "But his appearance," Alexander stammered, his previous confidence evaporating under Bob's stern gaze. "His appearance?" Bob's eyebrows shot up. "You mean the appearance of a man who built a multi-million-dollar agricultural empire from the ground up? Who employs over 200 people and just sold 3,000 acres for development at premium prices?" He shook his head in disappointment. "I suppose you'd rather deal with trust fund babies who don't know the value of a dollar?" Thomas stood quietly, maintaining his dignity despite the vindication he felt. He'd known Bob for years. Their paths had crossed frequently at agricultural aviation conferences, where Thomas had often chartered Bob's planes for crop surveys. Their friendship had grown from mutual respect and shared values about hard work and integrity. "I was actually about to call you," Thomas said to Bob, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thought it was time I stopped renting and got my own bird." Bob grinned broadly. "Well, you've come to the right place, even if some people here don't realize it yet." He turned to Alexander, his expression hardening. "Though I have to say, I'm disappointed in Sterling's hiring standards these days. When did discrimination become part of your sales strategy?" Alexander was now sweating visibly, his earlier arrogance replaced by mounting panic. "Sir, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. I was just about to show Mr. Miller our finest selection." "Save it," Bob cut him off. "I heard everything from the moment I walked in, and I'm pretty sure those folks over there got it all on video." He nodded toward a group of customers who were still holding their phones up, recording the scene. The receptionist who had initially dismissed Thomas was now frantically whispering into her phone, likely calling management. The security guards had already retreated, trying to look busy elsewhere in the showroom. Thomas, Bob said, deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear, why don't I show you around? I've owned 3 G650s myself, and I just sold my last one to upgrade to the G700. These are magnificent machines, but you need to know what to look for. He gestured toward the gleaming aircraft. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to take your business elsewhere. I know several dealers who would treat you with the respect you deserve. Before Thomas could respond, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s burst through the door, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Miller," he called out, hurrying over. "I'm James Sterling, owner of Sterling Executive Airport. I just heard about this unfortunate incident. Please, accept my sincerest apologies." The same people who had been snickering at Thomas earlier were now trying to catch his eye, offering ingratiating smiles and respectful nods. It was amazing how quickly attitudes could change when people realized their assumptions were wrong. Bob watched the scene unfold with satisfaction, while Thomas maintained the same calm dignity he'd shown throughout the ordeal. The farmer hadn't changed. He was still wearing his work clothes, still had dirt under his fingernails, still looked every bit the hard-working man he was proud to be. The only thing that had changed was other people's perception of him. Despite Bob's intervention and the owner's apology, not everyone in the showroom was ready to let go of their prejudices. A group of young executives who had been watching the scene unfold from the VIP lounge area decided to make their opinions known. "This is ridiculous," one of them said loudly, adjusting his Rolex watch with deliberate showmanship. "Sterling's used to be exclusive. Now they're letting anyone walk in off the street?" His companions laughed, the sound echoing through the high-ceilinged showroom. James Sterling, the owner, turned sharply toward the voice, but before he could respond, another member of the group chimed in. "What's next? Are we going to start selling private jets at the farmers market?" This drew more laughter, even from some of the other customers who had previously tried to distance themselves from the situation. Thomas stood quietly, his weathered face betraying no emotion, though his eyes hardened slightly. Bob Henderson's hand tightened on his shoulder, but Thomas gave him a subtle shake of the head. He could handle this himself. The ringleader of the group, emboldened by his friend's support, stepped forward. He was young, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of confidence that came from inherited wealth rather than earned success. "I mean, seriously," he announced to his growing audience, "does he even know how to file a flight plan? Or does he think you can just take off from between the cornrows?" The mockery was becoming more pointed, more personal. Several employees looked uncomfortable, but none dared to intervene. Even Alexander, the discriminatory salesman, seemed to realize things were going too far, taking a step back from the escalating situation. "Mr. Miller has every right to be here," James Sterling attempted to assert his authority, but his voice lacked conviction. It was clear he was torn between defending a potential customer and not wanting to offend his existing wealthy clientele. "Every right?" Another voice joined in, this time from a woman in a designer suit. "Look at him! He's tracking dirt all over the floor. This isn't some barn auction. There are standards to maintain." The young executives, encouraged by the growing support, began to circle closer. One of them pulled out his phone, deliberately taking photos. "This'll make a great social media post," he smirked. "Country bumpkin tries to play billionaire. Should go viral in no time." Thomas remained rooted in place, his stance solid as an oak. Years of facing down natural disasters and market crashes had given him a resilience these people couldn't understand. But Bob Henderson had seen enough. "You entitled little—" Bob started to move forward, but Thomas caught his arm. "It's all right, Bob," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly across the showroom. "Let them have their say. Sometimes people need to empty their cups before they can learn anything new." This philosophical response seemed to infuriate the group even more. The ringleader stepped closer, his expensive cologne almost overwhelming. "Oh, we've got ourselves a philosopher farmer. Tell us more about your wisdom from the fields. Maybe you can trade some magic beans for a down payment?" The mockery had drawn an even larger crowd now. Some looked embarrassed, others entertained, but most simply watched in uncomfortable silence as the scene unfolded. The young sales trainee who had been taking notes earlier had tears in her eyes, clearly distressed by the display of such naked prejudice. "I think," the ringleader continued, now playing to his audience, "we should start a collection, help the poor farmer fulfill his dreams. I've got some spare change in my car." He made a show of reaching for his wallet, pulling out a handful of bills. Though I doubt he could tell the difference between a G650 and a crop duster. James Sterling finally found his voice. "That's enough. This is still my establishment and—" But he was cut off by another executive. "Your establishment? Look around, James. Who do you think keeps this place in business? The Farmers Coalition?" The tension in the room was reaching a breaking point. Security guards hovered uncertainly at the edges of the crowd, unsure whose side they should be on. The receptionist was again frantically making calls, probably trying to reach higher management. Through it all, Thomas stood his ground, his face impassive but his eyes alert and observant. He'd faced down bullies before, in high school when his family lost everything in the drought of '82, in college when he worked 3 jobs to pay his agricultural science tuition, and in business when larger corporations tried to force him out. Each time, he'd emerged stronger, and this time would be no different. The ringleader, frustrated by Thomas's calm demeanor, decided to make one final push. He pulled out his phone and held it up high. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's document this historic moment. The day Sterling Executive Airport became Sterling Agricultural Airways. Maybe we can get him to pose next to the jet with his pitchfork?" Thomas Miller had spent his entire life letting his actions speak louder than his words. But standing there in the Sterling Executive Airport showroom, surrounded by mockery and prejudice, he realized that sometimes silence only empowers the wrong people. With deliberate slowness, he raised his hand, and to everyone's surprise, the room gradually fell quiet. "You know," he began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of commanding respect in the fields and boardrooms of agricultural business, "I've been thinking about what makes a person truly wealthy." His weathered hands were steady as he brushed some imaginary dust from his overalls. "And I'm not talking about the kind of wealth that sits in bank accounts." The ringleader of the executives started to smirk, but Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "I employ over 200 people back home. Good, honest folk who trust me with their livelihoods. Every morning, when I wake up before dawn, I carry the responsibility of their families on my shoulders. Can any of you say the same?" A subtle shift occurred in the room. Some of the onlookers who had been recording the confrontation lowered their phones, suddenly conscious of their own role in the spectacle. "You mock my clothes," Thomas gestured to his work-worn attire. "But these clothes helped build something lasting, something real. Each stain tells a story of growth, of perseverance, of turning bare earth into abundance." He took a step forward, and surprisingly, the group of executives took a collective step back. "You joke about magic beans," he continued, addressing the ringleader directly. "But do you know what it takes to feed a nation? To understand the delicate balance between soil chemistry and crop yields? To make decisions that affect not just your bottom line, but the lives of hundreds of families." Bob Henderson stood proudly to the side, watching his friend command the room with quiet dignity. The young sales trainee had pulled out a fresh notebook, frantically capturing every word. "I came here today not to prove anything to anyone," Thomas's voice remained steady, "but to purchase a tool for my business. Yes, a private jet is a luxury, but it's also an investment that will help me better serve the 5 states where we now operate, the 37 organic restaurants that depend on our premium produce, and the thousands of customers who trust our brand." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a soil-stained business card. "You see this dirt? It's not just dirt, it's the foundation of a multi-million-dollar operation, an operation I built from the ground up, without inherited wealth or fancy connections." He let that sink in for a moment. "Each season, I bet everything on my ability to work with nature, to innovate, to adapt. And each season, I'm accountable not to shareholders or board members, but to the land itself." The ringleader's smirk had completely vanished now, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. The woman who had complained about dirt on the floor was staring intently at her expensive shoes. You know what's truly ironic? Thomas allowed himself a small smile. While you've been standing here mocking me, 3 of your competitors have already reached out through my assistant, offering private viewings at their facilities. He pulled out his phone, displaying a series of messages. They seem to understand something you don't. That success isn't about how you look, it's about what you build. James Sterling, the owner, had turned an interesting shade of red. The discriminatory salesman, Alexander, was frantically typing something into his tablet, perhaps finally researching who Thomas Miller really was. So yes, Thomas concluded, his voice filling the now silent showroom. I may not fit your image of a private jet buyer. I may track some dirt on your pristine floors. But while you've been judging my appearance, I've been judging something far more important, your character. And so far, with a few notable exceptions, he nodded towards Bob and the young sales trainee. I'm not impressed. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the distant sound of jets taking off seemed muted, as if nature itself was acknowledging the gravity of the moment. The group of executives who had been so vocal minutes ago now seemed to be trying their best to blend into the background. Mr. Miller? James Sterling stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly. Please allow me to personally But Thomas raised his hand again, cutting him off. Save your apologies, Mr. Sterling. They won't clean the stain this incident has left on your reputation. Actions speak louder than words, something I learned long ago in the fields, where promises don't make crops grow. Only dedicated work does. The tension in Sterling Executive Airport's showroom was palpable as Thomas reached into his weathered leather briefcase. The room had fallen into complete silence, every eye fixed on his movements. Even the young executives who had been mocking him earlier seemed to hold their breath. You know, Thomas said, pulling out a thick manila envelope, I wasn't planning to do business this way. I believe in quiet dignity and letting your work speak for itself. He placed the envelope on the gleaming glass table beside him. But sometimes, a lesson needs to be taught. From the envelope, he extracted a series of documents, each one meticulously organized with colored tabs. This first document, he said, holding up a paper with the state seal clearly visible, is the deed to what used to be the Miller family farm's original 3,000 acres. I say used to be, because last week I sold it to Green Valley Development Corporation for a figure that would make even your head spin. The ringleader of the executive group shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado evaporating. As it turned out, he recognized the Green Valley Development logo. His own father sat on their board of directors. The second document, Thomas continued, his voice steady and clear, is a contract with Western Organic Distributors. We supply premium organic produce to over 200 high-end restaurants across 5 states. Time-sensitive deliveries are crucial, which is precisely why I'm in the market for a private jet. James Sterling, the owner, had moved closer, his eyes widening as he scanned the numbers on the contracts Thomas was displaying. The discriminatory salesman, Alexander, looked like he might faint. And this, Thomas said, pulling out a bank statement with multiple pages, is just one of our corporate accounts. I believe the balance speaks for itself. He laid it on the table, where the 7-figure number was clearly visible to anyone nearby. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back whispered, "That's more than my entire portfolio." The young sales trainee who had been taking notes dropped her pen, scrambling to pick it up with shaking hands. But Thomas wasn't finished. He extracted another document, this one bearing the logo of a prestigious aviation training institute. While you were making assumptions about my knowledge of aviation, none of you bothered to ask about my qualifications. I've held a private pilot's license for 15 years. I've logged over 2,000 flight hours, mostly in smaller aircraft for crop surveillance and business travel. Bob Henderson was beaming now, watching his friend systematically dismantle every prejudiced assumption that had been made about him. And finally, Thomas said, pulling out one last document. This is a letter of intent from your biggest competitor, Eagle Ridge Aviation. They're offering me a significant discount on their latest G650, along with priority maintenance and hangar space. He paused, letting that sink in. I received this offer just 10 minutes ago, while you were all busy judging my clothes and making jokes about farmers. The ringleader of the executive group had backed away completely now, furiously texting on his phone, probably trying to damage control with his father, who would undoubtedly hear about this incident soon. Mr. Miller, James Sterling stepped forward, his face ashen. I cannot begin to express. What's interesting, Thomas interrupted, gathering his documents with deliberate slowness, is that none of this should matter. Whether I had these papers or not, I deserved to be treated with basic human dignity. The size of my bank account doesn't make me more or less worthy of respect. He turned to face the group of executives who had mocked him. You see these calluses? He held up his weathered hands. Each one represents thousands of hours of hard work, strategic decisions, and risk-taking. While you were making jokes about magic beans, I was building an agricultural empire that your investment portfolios probably depend on more than you realize. The impact of his words was visible on every face in the room. The previous mockery had been replaced by a mix of shame, embarrassment, and, from some, a dawning respect. The thing about farming, Thomas continued, his voice taking on a teacher's tone, is that it teaches you patience. You learn to wait for the right moment, for the soil to be ready, for the weather to turn, for the harvest to mature. Today, I waited to show you these documents, not because I needed to prove anything, but because you needed to learn something. Just as the impact of Thomas's revelations was sinking in, the showroom's glass doors swung open with authority. A tall, distinguished-looking woman in a sharp charcoal business suit strode in, followed by two equally well-dressed men carrying premium leather briefcases. The woman's presence commanded immediate attention. There was something about her bearing that spoke of both power and purpose. Her heels clicked purposefully against the marble floor, each step echoing through the now silent showroom. "Dad," she called out, her voice carrying across the space with practiced authority. "I got your message." The room fell into stunned silence as Catherine Miller, one of the state's most prominent corporate attorneys and named partner at Miller, Chen & Associates, made her way to her father's side. The contrast between them was striking, her in her impeccably tailored designer suit and Christian Louboutin heels, him in his work-worn overalls and scuffed boots. Yet they shared the same unwavering confidence in their bearing and the same determined set to their jaw. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, embracing her father before turning to face the crowd with steel in her eyes. "But it seems I arrived just in time." She gestured to her colleagues. "Allow me to introduce David Chen, our firm's aviation law specialist with 20 years of experience in aircraft acquisition litigation, and Michael Roberts, our civil rights attorney who's never lost a discrimination case in 15 years of practice." The young executives who had been mocking Thomas earlier seemed to shrink into themselves, their previous bravado evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. The ringleader had gone pale, recognizing Catherine from recent headlines about a major discrimination lawsuit she'd won against a Fortune 500 company, a case that had resulted in a 9-figure settlement and mandatory corporate restructuring. "Ms. Miller?" James Sterling stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "We were just discussing—" "Oh, I know exactly what you were discussing," Catherine interrupted, her tone arctic enough to freeze flames. "You see, my father may be old school about technology, but I'm not. One of your customers was kind enough to live stream the entire incident. It's already trending on several social media platforms, and my team has been archiving every single comment, share, and reaction." She pulled out her tablet, turning it to show the room. The hashtag # Sterling discrimination was rapidly climbing Twitter's trending list, accompanied by video clips of the earlier confrontation. The view counts were climbing by the thousands every minute. Additionally, David Chen spoke up, opening his briefcase and extracting a thick folder of documents. "We've received copies of several internal emails from Sterling executive employees discussing ways to, and I quote, keep the farmer out and maintain our elite clientele. Those will make for interesting reading in court, especially the ones suggesting a pattern of discriminatory practices." The discriminatory salesman, Alexander, looked like he might faint, his earlier arrogance replaced by naked fear. James Sterling had to steady himself against a nearby counter, his face ashen as he realized the full implications of what was unfolding. "Now," Catherine continued, her legal training evident in every measured word, "we have documented evidence of discriminatory behavior, harassment, and attempted public humiliation. We have witness statements being collected as we speak." She gestured around the room, where several customers who had observed the earlier treatment were nodding in agreement. "We also have proof of your employees conspiring to deny service based on appearance and perceived social status." She paused, letting each point land with precision. "In legal terms, we call this a slam dunk. In financial terms, we call it catastrophic exposure." Bob Henderson, who had been watching the scene unfold with satisfaction, finally spoke up. "I've been in aviation for 30 years, served on the board of 3 major charter companies, and I've never seen such blatant discrimination. You can bet my testimony will be part of this too, and my reputation in this industry carries significant weight." The young sales trainee who had been documenting everything gathered her courage and stepped forward. I have notes too, and recordings. What they did, it wasn't right. I have documented every discriminatory incident I've witnessed since starting here 3 months ago." She pulled out a thick notebook, including comments made during staff meetings about maintaining a certain class of clientele. Catherine smiled warmly at the trainee. "Thank you for your integrity. We'll be in touch. Whistleblower protections will, of course, be arranged." She turned back to James Sterling, her expression hardening again. "Your employees and customers didn't just humiliate my father. They revealed a deeply rooted culture of discrimination in your establishment, one that needs to be addressed systematically and publicly." Michael Roberts, the civil rights attorney, stepped forward, his presence as imposing as his reputation. "We're prepared to file suit immediately, not just against Sterling Executive, but against each individual involved in today's incident. The damages could be substantial. Given the viral nature of the incident and the clear evidence of coordinated discrimination, we're looking at a landmark case that could reshape how luxury retailers handle customer interactions." The ringleader of the executive group finally found his voice, though it quavered slightly. "Now wait a minute, we were just what?" Catherine cut him off, her voice sharp as a scalpel. "Just publicly mocking a successful business owner? Just attempting to humiliate him on social media? Just discriminating against him based on his appearance?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Please continue. Every word you say will be noted for the record and added to the complaint." The following week, in the imposing chambers of the state courthouse, the Sterling Executive Airport discrimination case began to unfold. The mahogany-paneled courtroom was packed to capacity, with journalists from major news outlets filling the back rows. The story of the farmer who faced discrimination while trying to buy a private jet had captured national attention, touching a nerve in conversations about class prejudice and appearance-based discrimination. Judge Eleanor Martinez, known for her no-nonsense approach to civil rights cases, surveyed the room with sharp eyes behind her wire-rimmed glasses. On one side sat Thomas Miller, still in his work clothes, a conscious choice that his daughter had supported, flanked by Catherine and her legal team. On the other side, Sterling Executive's corporate lawyers sat beside James Sterling and his employees, all looking considerably less confident than they had in their showroom. "Before we begin," Judge Martinez addressed the court, "I want to be clear about the gravity of this case. This isn't just about one incident of discrimination. The evidence presented suggests a systemic issue that demands thorough examination." Catherine Miller rose, her preparation evident in every measured movement. "Your Honor, We'd like to begin by presenting evidence of a pattern of discriminatory behavior at Sterling Executive Airport. She gestured to her assistant, who began distributing thick binders to the court. These documents contain emails, internal memos, and witness statements spanning the last 5 years. The young sales trainee, now identified as Sarah Chen, no relation to the attorney, was the first witness called to the stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the oath, but her voice was steady as she began to testify. "It wasn't just that day with Mr. Miller," she explained, referring to her detailed notes. "We were explicitly trained to profile customers based on their appearance. There was a coded language used. Maintaining standards meant keeping out people who didn't look wealthy enough. Quality control meant finding ways to discourage certain types of people from even entering the showroom." The Sterling executive legal team shifted uncomfortably as Sarah continued to detail specific instances of discrimination she had witnessed. Their discomfort grew as she produced recordings of staff meetings where such practices were openly discussed. Next came Bob Henderson's testimony, carrying the weight of his 3 decades in aviation. "What I witnessed that day wasn't just unprofessional. It was a textbook case of discriminatory practices that unfortunately persist in luxury aviation. Mr. Miller was subjected to treatment that no customer should ever face, regardless of their appearance or background." James Sterling's corporate attorney attempted to paint the incident as an isolated occurrence, but his arguments felt hollow against the mounting evidence. The security camera footage from the showroom, synced with audio from multiple cell phone recordings, painted a damning picture of coordinated discrimination. The most powerful moment came when Thomas himself took the stand. He spoke not with anger, but with the measured wisdom of someone who had faced and overcome prejudice throughout his life. "I didn't come to Sterling Executive that day looking for trouble," he testified, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap. "I came as a businessman seeking to make a legitimate purchase. What I encountered wasn't just rudeness. It was a reminder that no matter how much success you achieve, some people will only ever see what they want to see." During cross-examination, Sterling's attorneys tried to suggest that Thomas had been confrontational, but the video evidence contradicted their every attempt. The footage clearly showed his dignified response to increasingly hostile treatment. The ringleader of the executive group, now identified as Bradley Winchester III, was called to testify about his role in the incident. His attempt to dismiss his actions as just jokes fell flat, especially when confronted with the social media posts he had attempted to delete, all of which Catherine's team had archived. "Mr. Winchester," Catherine began her cross-examination, "could you explain to the court why you felt it appropriate to mock a potential customer based on his appearance?" Bradley squirmed in his seat. "It was just, he didn't look like he belonged there." "And who decides who belongs where, Mr. Winchester?" Catherine pressed. "Is there a dress code for having dignity? A minimum bank balance for deserving respect?" As the day progressed, the systematic nature of Sterling Executive's discriminatory practices became increasingly clear. Former employees came forward with their own stories, and other customers shared similar experiences of prejudicial treatment. Judge Martinez's expression grew progressively sterner as the evidence mounted. During a particularly revealing moment, she interrupted proceedings to address Sterling's legal team directly. "Counselor," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench, "I hope your clients understand that this case has implications far beyond a single incident. What we're seeing here appears to be institutional discrimination, carefully coded but clearly practiced. The court takes such matters very seriously?" Just as the court proceedings seemed to be reaching their conclusion, an unexpected development electrified the courtroom. Patricia Martinez, no relation to the judge, a former senior customer service manager at Sterling Executive who had resigned 3 months prior, requested to testify as a last-minute witness. Her appearance caused visible distress among Sterling's legal team, who immediately huddled together in whispered consultation, their faces growing paler by the second. "Your Honor," Patricia began, after being sworn in, her hands clasped tightly together to stop their trembling. I've been following this case closely, and I can no longer remain silent. What happened to Mr. Miller wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a carefully orchestrated system that I helped create, to my eternal shame. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Patricia pulled out a USB drive from her designer handbag, her fingers shaking slightly as she held it up. On this drive are training materials, internal communications, and detailed protocols that we developed specifically to discourage what we called undesirable clientele from making purchases. The documentation spans 5 years and includes video recordings of training sessions, email chains, and internal memos. Catherine Miller leaned forward. Her interest piqued. Could you elaborate on these protocols, Ms. Martinez? We called it the Platinum Standard Program, Patricia explained, her voice heavy with regret. It was never written into official company policy, but it was thoroughly ingrained in our training. We had a point system based on appearance, manner of dress, and perceived social status. Employees were actually rewarded for successfully directing customers who scored low on our scale. She proceeded to share screenshots of internal chat groups where employees shared success stories of turning away customers who didn't fit their preferred profile. The evidence was damning, showing a systematic approach to discrimination that went far beyond individual bias. The chat logs revealed a disturbing culture of mockery and elitism, with employees competing to come up with the most creative ways to discourage undesirable customers. Mr. Miller's experience? Patricia continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. That was actually considered a textbook execution of our protocols. The progressive escalation of dismissive behavior, the public humiliation, the subtle encouragement of other customers to join in. It was all part of our standard operating procedure. We even had a name for it, the gentle push. The Sterling executive legal team's attempts to object were overruled as Patricia produced document after document supporting her claims. Each piece of evidence revealed another layer of the discriminatory practices that had become deeply embedded in the company's culture. Your Honor, Patricia said, pulling out her phone, her hands now steady with determination. I also have audio recordings of multiple executive meetings where these policies were explicitly discussed and refined, including one particularly illuminating conversation with Mr. Sterling himself from our annual strategy meeting last December. The recording, when played, filled the courtroom with James Sterling's unmistakable voice. Remember, we're not just selling jets, we're selling exclusivity. If anyone can walk in and buy our products, we lose our premium status. Make sure the right sort of people feel welcome and the wrong sort, well, you know what to do. Our brand depends on maintaining certain standards. Patricia then revealed a comprehensive spreadsheet tracking what they called successful deterrence cases, instances where potential customers were discouraged from making purchases based on their appearance or perceived status. The data showed hundreds of cases over the past 3 years alone, each meticulously documented with notes about the customer's appearance, behavior, and the techniques used to discourage them. Each entry in this spreadsheet, Patricia explained, her voice trembling slightly, represents someone like Mr. Miller, someone who was judged not by their character or capabilities, but by our shallow, prejudiced standards. Some of these people were successful business owners, doctors, entrepreneurs. But because they didn't fit our narrow definition of what a luxury aircraft buyer should look like, they were systematically pushed away. The young sales trainee, Sarah Chen, was recalled to the stand to corroborate Patricia's testimony. She confirmed that the training materials matched exactly what she had received during her onboarding, adding her own detailed notes about how these discriminatory practices were taught to new employees. We were even given role-playing scenarios, Sarah testified, clutching her notebook tightly, where we practiced different techniques for making undesirable customers feel uncomfortable enough to leave voluntarily. It was presented as maintaining our brand standards, but looking back, I'm horrified by how deliberately discriminatory it was. We had specific scripts for different types of customers, all designed to make them feel out of place and unwelcome. Patricia's testimony continued with details about quarterly performance reviews, where employees' success in maintaining standards was evaluated and rewarded. She provided documentation of bonus structures tied directly to their ability to manage customer demographics, including internal emails discussing target percentages for different customer profiles. The most disturbing part, Patricia concluded, her voice heavy with emotion, was how we normalized this behavior. We convinced ourselves we were protecting the brand, maintaining exclusivity, but in reality, we were perpetuating a system of discrimination that has no place in modern society. We wrapped our prejudices in corporate language and pretended we were doing something necessary and professional, when in fact we were simply being cruel and discriminatory. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Martinez prepared to deliver her final verdict. The case had lasted several intense weeks, drawing national media attention and sparking widespread discussions about discrimination in luxury retail. Thomas sat calmly in his familiar work clothes, the same quiet dignity about him that he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. Having reviewed all evidence presented, Judge Martinez began, adjusting her glasses. This court finds Sterling Executive Airport and its employees guilty of systematic discrimination and willful harassment. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. The evidence provided by Ms. Martinez and others reveals not just isolated incidents, but a deeply rooted culture of discrimination that cannot be tolerated in our society. The judge proceeded to outline the penalties. Sterling Executive Airport is hereby ordered to pay damages totaling $50 million, with $30 million to be paid directly to Mr. Miller, and $20 million to establish a foundation for promoting inclusivity in luxury retail and aviation industries. She continued, her voice firm and resolute. Additionally, Sterling Executive must undergo a complete corporate restructuring, including mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, the establishment of an independent oversight committee, and quarterly audits of their customer service practices for the next 5 years. James Sterling, who had aged visibly during the trial, slumped in his chair. His empire's reputation was in shambles, and the financial penalties would force significant changes in how they operated. Furthermore, the judge added, the court orders Sterling Executive to issue a public apology and implement new corporate policies explicitly prohibiting discrimination based on appearance or perceived social status. The company will also be required to create a scholarship program for aspiring pilots from underprivileged backgrounds. Thomas stood to address the court one final time. Your Honor, if I may? After receiving her nod, he continued, I'd like to announce that I'm planning to use the majority of the damages awarded to establish a fund for agricultural aviation programs, helping small farmers access air transportation for their businesses. Sometimes the best response to discrimination is to create new opportunities for others. The announcement drew appreciative murmurs from the courtroom. Catherine smiled proudly at her father, knowing this was exactly the kind of response she'd expected from him. 1 month later, Thomas stood on the tarmac of a different airport, admiring his new jet, purchased from Eagle Ridge Aviation, Sterling's biggest competitor. The aircraft gleamed in the morning sun, its sleek lines a testament to modern engineering. But more importantly, it represented a victory not just for him, but for anyone who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character. Bob Henderson stood beside him, grinning broadly. She's a beauty, isn't she? And Eagle Ridge's team treated you like royalty. They did, Thomas nodded. But you know what's more important? They treat everyone with respect, regardless of how they're dressed. The story had made national headlines. Farmers' victory against discrimination reshapes luxury aviation industry. The case had become a catalyst for change, prompting many high-end retailers and service providers to re-evaluate their customer service policies and corporate cultures. Sarah Chen, the former Sterling trainee, had been hired as Eagle Ridge's new director of customer relations, specifically tasked with implementing inclusive customer service practices. Patricia Martinez was now consulting with various luxury brands, helping them develop more equitable service policies. As Thomas prepared for his first flight in his new jet, his family gathered to celebrate. His daughter Catherine stood proudly beside him along with his wife and grandchildren. Even some of his farm workers had come to share in the moment. "You know," Thomas said to the assembled group, "this was never about the jet. It was about standing up for what's right, about showing that dignity isn't about what you wear or how you look. It's about who you are inside." He looked at his grandchildren, his voice growing thoughtful. "Remember this day, kids. Not because your grandpa bought a fancy airplane, but because sometimes you have to stand your ground, even when people try to make you feel small. Success isn't about fitting in. It's about staying true to who you are." The ensuing years would see significant changes in the luxury aviation industry. Sterling executive under new management became a model for inclusive customer service. The Miller Agricultural Aviation Fund helped numerous small farmers expand their operations through air transport. But, perhaps most importantly, the case became a teaching moment for businesses across the country about the true cost of discrimination and the value of treating everyone with dignity and respect. As Thomas's jet took off into the clear blue sky, it carried with it not just a farmer who had achieved his dream, but a message that would inspire generations to come. True class isn't about what you own or what you wear. It's about how you treat others, regardless of their appearance or background.